All right, well, welcome and good evening. We are here on Wednesday night getting ready to look at the book of Genesis. This week we begin chapter 39. Chapter 38, what we looked at last week, that was the chapter that almost seemed to be a bit of a departure. Because in chapter 37 we see the life of Joseph beginning, and then 38 almost seems to be a little break. We go from Joseph's life to Judah and Tamar and the events that happen there. It really isn't really much of a departure. These things are all connected, but it seems like that at first anyways. But now in chapter 39 we begin again, or I should say we continue in the life of Joseph. Let's pick up chapter 39. We'll read verses 1 through 6. And the text says this: Now Joseph had been brought down to Egypt, and Potiphar, an officer of Pharaoh, the captain of the guard, an Egyptian, had bought him from the Ishmaelites who had brought him down there. The Lord was with Joseph, and he became a successful man, and he was in the house of the Egyptian master. His master saw that the Lord was with him, and that the Lord caused all that he did to succeed in his hand. So Joseph found favor in his sight and attended him. And he made him overseer of his house and put him in charge of all that he had. From the time that he had made him overseer in his house and over all that he had, the Lord blessed the Egyptian's house for Joseph's sake. The blessing of the Lord was on all that he had in the house and field. So he left all that he had in Joseph's charge, and because of him, he had no concern about anything but the food he ate. Now Joseph was handsome in form and appearance. All right, so what is one of the first things that we see, or what's one of the first things that we notice as we begin these first 6 verses? Well, I think what we can see is, even though Joseph is in captivity, right? Joseph is, he is a slave, and of course he's innocent in a very real way, right? He hasn't really done anything deserving of death or being put into slavery or anything like that. You know, he was sold into slavery by his brothers. Now, we talked about how Joseph was immature, and I think there was some sinful, prideful behavior there. But again, I don't think there was anything that was the brothers were justified in selling him into slavery. But we see what happens when there's jealousy, when there's envy, when there's favoritism, things like that. There's sin plenty of sin and blame for all involved. But here we see that even though Joseph is in captivity, even though he's a slave, God is with him. And that's important. We're going to see that throughout the text as we continue through the life of Joseph. We're going to see that God is continually with him. Now, what does Potiphar know? What does he recognize? What does he see? What is he aware of? Well, he's aware that the Lord is with Joseph. Now, whether or not Potiphar knows who the Lord is by name or anything like that, it doesn't really matter. He may very well know something about the one true God, Yahweh. Now, he probably wouldn't recognize Yahweh as the one true God, but he might know something about the Lord. But even if he knows nothing, he knows that there is a power, we could say, that there is a deity, that there is a God behind Joseph blessing him. So he recognizes that the Lord's with him. He recognizes something about that situation. There's something special about this young man, and he pays attention to it. He pays attention to it. So what does Potiphar end up doing? Not only does he recognize what's going on, he sees that Joseph is blessed by the Lord, but he does something. He takes action. He puts him in charge of his whole household. He puts him in charge of everything in the field. He puts him in charge of everything in his house. Joseph is in charge of everything. And in fact, the text says in verse 6 that because of Joseph, Potiphar had no concern about anything except for the food that he ate. He just left him in charge of everything. So again, everything that Joseph touches, we could say, prospers, is blessed. It's kind of like having the Midas touch, right? Everything he touches turns to gold in a sense. And this pagan, right? Potiphar is a pagan. He's an Egyptian. This pagan is actually being blessed through Joseph. And he knows it. He knows it. He's recognizing it. And he's willing to put him in charge of everything. Now, let's ask the question. Let's think about this for a moment. All right? Let's think about big picture. Big picture. What did God promise to Abraham? Now, we're going back. We're going back a number of chapters here. What had God promised to Abraham? Well, God had said that he was going to be with him. He said that through him, all the nations of the earth would be blessed. Now, we know that that's pointing forward to Jesus, that through Jesus, all the nations of the earth, all the peoples, all the tribes, all the languages of the earth, right? All those people who are of different language groups and ethnic groups, they're all going to be blessed through Jesus. But he also promises Abraham that anyone who blesses him, God's going to bless. And of course, anybody who curses him, God is going to curse. God is going to be with Abraham. And those who are friends with Abraham, they're going to receive a blessing. And those who are enemies of Abraham, they're going to receive a curse. God is going to be their enemy, kind of thing. And here, we can see that that promise was not just for Abraham. We can see that there's an overflowing, right? That promise flows to Abraham and through Abraham to Isaac and to Jacob and now to Joseph. And we see that God is blessing those who are around or in close contact with Joseph. We're going to see it again, but here we see it. For the moment, we see it in Potiphar's life. Now, when people are around or in close contact with, close relationship with God's people in some form or fashion, they will often be blessed. What they're experiencing is God's blessings as they flow to his people and through his people into the world. God's blessings are certainly meant for his people, but they're also meant for the world. And those who are close to the family of God, even if they're not Christians, even if they've not given their life over, will often feel the effects. They will often receive some of the blessing of being in close proximity. In fact, Paul will talk about that in the marriage covenant, that there's a blessing that happens, and of course, the unbelieving husband or the unbelieving wife may save their spouse, but there's some kind of a blessing there when people are in close proximity to the people of God, because God's blessings flow around and through. It's kind of like my cup overflows, right? The cup overflows into the lives of other people. Now, are there blessings for God's people even when things look bad? When things are not ideal, when it really feels like it's raining, it really feels like there's dark clouds around, it really feels like the weight of the world is on the shoulders of God's people, are there still blessings from God? Absolutely. We see it here, don't we? Even though Joseph is in captivity, even though this is not an ideal situation, he is still receiving blessings from God. And again, we need to notice God is with him. God has not left him. God is with us. Even when things are bad, even when things look horrible, God is in the midst of it with us. And there are blessings. There are blessings. And we really ought to consider that hymn that we sing. Count your blessings, right? Count your many blessings, name them one by one. Count your blessings, name them one by one. Count your blessings, see what God has done. Count your blessings, name them one by one, right? Count your many blessings, see what God has done. In the midst, even in the midst of difficult times, of sufferings, of trials, of hardships, we can look around and find God still providing blessings. We just simply have to have eyes to see. Joseph, if he had eyes to see, I think he did, can see God working. Can see God working. Even though things aren't ideal, God's in the midst of all of it. All right, let's continue reading. I'm going to read verses 7 through verse 10. So starting in verse 7, going through verse 10, we continue the story, and it says this. And after a time, notice it's a time, we don't know how long it's been, but it's just after some time. So after a time, his master's wife cast her eyes on Joseph and said, lie with me. But he refused and said to his master's wife, behold, because of me, my master has no concern about anything in the house. And he's put everything that he has in my charge. He is not greater in this house than I am, nor has he kept back anything from me except you, because you are his wife. How then can I do this great wickedness and sin against God? And as she spoke to Joseph day after day, he would not listen to her, to lie beside her, or to be with her. Okay, Joseph is doing well. He is. He's doing well. Even though he's in slavery, he's doing well. He's a handsome young man. He's in charge of all of Potiphar's household and the function of things. He's the overseer. He's in charge. And God's with him, right? He's in a really good place despite being a slave, right? And then what happens? Temptation comes, doesn't it? And what kind of temptation comes to Joseph? Well, there's certainly the sexual aspect, isn't there? And, let's be honest, right? Let's talk frankly. Joseph is a young man. A lot of times, young men, hormones are raging, different things like that. Sexual promiscuity could be very easy to jump into, right? It's still sinful, it's still wicked, all of that kind of thing. But that's a strong temptation, especially for a young man who's in captivity, right? Joseph's in captivity. We know, at least at the moment, there's no mention of him having any kind of a wife or anything. That comes later. So, this could be a very difficult thing for him to resist. And we don't want to downplay that, right? The sexual temptation is a very real thing. In fact, it's very real in our world today, isn't it? Isn't it? Yeah. A lot of sexual immorality in the world, and both young men and women, and we could just say men and women in general, can fall into that trap and jump headlong into this kind of sin. But I think there's something else going on here as well. The reality is, he can also, if he gives into this temptation, he can also, in a sense, have it all. He's a good-looking man. He's in a position of authority, and he can even have Potiphar's wife, and think about this for a moment, possibly even gain his freedom. Well, how might that happen? Well, if Joseph had a romantic relationship with Potiphar's wife, is it possible? We're just thinking about in the realm of possibilities, right? If he were to have a romantic relationship with this woman, is it possible that they could both plot the death of Potiphar and or plan Joseph's escape? Is that within the realm of possibilities? Well, I think we would have to say yes. I mean, sure it is, right? We've all heard of husbands and wives having affairs with other people and then running away with them, or even planning and plotting to kill their spouse. And sometimes they get away with committing the murder. They don't usually get away with the murder, they're held accountable, right? They go to jail and things, but they get away with actually taking the person's life. That happens. And in the ancient world, it would have had the same kinds of things would have been going on. All kinds of treachery, all kinds of deceit and scheming and plotting and planning, and murders would have been very, very common back then. So the temptation that Joseph faces may not only be sexual, and again, not that isn't certainly a major temptation, but there also might be the temptation for his freedom. That he might be able to get his freedom if he were to have a relationship with this woman. If you were in slavery and were presented with an opportunity to escape, would you justify sleeping with someone in order to escape? Some of us right away would say, no, I couldn't do that, wouldn't do that. It's not even something that would come. But some of us, maybe we should slow down for a moment. Would this be a temptation? I think it would be a temptation for some of us. It was a temptation for Joseph. Now, he didn't sin. He didn't do it. But it was a temptation. If it wouldn't have had some kind of an appeal, it wouldn't be a temptation, right? When given second thought. But there's a temptation there. There is that possibility. And maybe it flickered in his mind a moment. What are the possibilities here? But anyways, he's tempted with this, and we too might very well have been tempted to say, you know what, I'm going to justify my sinful behavior in order to gain my freedom. Remember, Joseph was here unjustly. He really didn't do anything deserving of being sold off into slavery, right? So again, if you were a slave, you were presented with this opportunity, would you justify sleeping with someone in order to escape? Well, you have to think about that, but I think you should. Think about that for a moment. Now, what does Joseph do in this situation? Well, we know. He refuses, right? He refuses to go along with this. And he says, very interesting, look at what he says. In verse 9, how then can I do this great wickedness and sin against my master? Sin against Potiphar? No. How can I do this great thing and sin against God? Here's an important point to keep in mind. Very important. All sins, regardless of what they are and who they involve, all sins are first and foremost against God. You can't commit a sin and it not be against God first. You might be able to sin against God alone. You might be able to sin against God alone in some way and not against maybe your neighbor or something like that, kind of directly. But you can never sin, any sin, that is not first and foremost against God. In this passage, we see that Joseph recognizes that, right? He recognizes that if he were to sleep with this woman, that'd be a sin against God. Yeah, of course it would be a sin against his master Potiphar. But he recognizes, Joseph is seeing the big picture, that this is first and foremost a sin against God. Not only Joseph, but David. You remember David. When he's confronted about his idolatry with Bathsheba and the murder of Uriah the Hittite, what does he say? What does he say about that whole incident? Well, we see it recorded in 2 Samuel chapter 12 and verse 13. But David also writes a psalm about this whole story, this whole event. Psalm 51 and verse 4 says, this is David speaking about this whole situation. He says, against you, he's talking about God, against you only have I sinned and done what is evil in your sight. Now, Had David sinned against Bathsheba? Yes. Had David sinned against Uriah? Yes. Had he committed murder and adultery and all that? Absolutely. But he recognized that his sin was against God. He says, God alone. Yes, he sinned against other people, but first and foremost, and of the most important, he had sinned against God. See, the real question is, do we understand that all of our sins are first against God? You know, I wonder if we had that in the forefront of our minds, if that would help prevent us from sinning. If we thought and really understood in the midst of temptation, if I commit this, if I lie, if I gossip, if I slander another, if I speak evil of another, if I'm greedy, if I do whatever it is I do, if I sin, I am first and foremost sinning against God. I wonder if it would make us stop and think and possibly even help check us, keep us in check. I don't know, something for us to contemplate. The more we keep that in mind, probably the better off we are, right? How often, though, let's get back to Joseph. How often is Joseph tempted by this woman? Is it just once off? You know, she comes to him one time and says, hey, sleep with me. No, she comes to him, it says daily. No, she comes to him daily. This is a daily temptation, something that he cannot avoid. He is stuck, right? He's a slave. He can't escape this woman. He can't go on vacation. He can't leave and go somewhere else and get away from her. This is a daily temptation, something that he can't avoid. You ever have something in your life, something you struggle with that's a daily temptation, something that seems to follow you around day to day? Well, Joseph understood that. If you've ever felt that way, if you have anything in your life that's like that, Joseph understood that he had a daily temptation. And here's the thing, we see our character and we see our faith when we're tempted with something, not just once, but on a regular basis. We see what kind of people we are when we will not give in, even in the face of constant temptation, daily temptation. Sometimes, here's something to think about. Sometimes we ask God to help us grow, don't we? We pray to God, we ask him to mature us. Give us more faith, increase our faith, strengthen our faith, help us to grow in our patience, and help us to grow in our loving of others. And then we sit back and we wonder why we have all these trials and difficulties. Why do we have difficult people around us? Why, Father, do I have all these people that seem to test my patience? Why is that happening? People in situations that are just there, and we feel like it's such a burden. I want to be more patient. How come there's all these people around me that are really trying my patience? Now, people in situations that are able, if we rely on God, they're able to make us strong, more loving, more faithful, more patient. See, the things and the situations around us, if we rely on God, can help us grow. I think Joseph was growing in his faithfulness as temptation continued to come and he continued to stand up to it. I think his faith was growing. Somebody once said this. Someone said, be careful what you pray for. You might just get it. Father, make me more patient. Oh, and he brings people in our lives that help us to grow in our patience. Make me more loving. Make me more giving. Help me to be a more mature man, a more mature woman in Christ. And situations and people come in our lives that God uses, if we rely on him, to make us stronger and more faithful. Be careful what you pray for. You might just get it. Well, we're going to stop there for this week. I think there's a lot there for us to contemplate and consider, and we will come back again, Lord willing, next week, and we will pick up from where we are. We'll pick up in verses 11. So we'll start back in chapter 39, looking at verse 11 and going forward. Well, God bless you. I pray that this has been fruitful. I pray that it's been a blessing to you, and I pray that you continue to grow and mature in your faith. God bless.